Hello and welcome to the Jus Gentium podcast from the Law Academy. This podcast looks at all things relating to international law and international relations. Hence the name Jus Gentium, referring to the Roman law of nations. We're concerning ourselves with all the things to do with the relationship between states and how geopolitics and international law shapes these relationships. Now, this first episode is going to be concerning some of the most important news that we have seen coming out of international law and international relations in the last few weeks. Now, the majority of international law news, at least in my opinion so far, has this year concerned the fallout from the transfer of power from the previously existing Biden administration to the Trump administration, the second Trump administration. And this episode is going to concern ourselves in looking at the Gaza Plan that was proposed by Trump, I believe last week, or it might have been late the week before. Now, fundamentally, what I'm going to do in this podcast is explain what the plan is, or at least the best that we can actually explain. Talk about the international legal concerns. It shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody that this plan that was proposed by Donald Trump in relation to the Gaza Strip is unlawful and has no basis in international law. I'll explain why that is the case, and I'll use some citations to reference this as well. We will talk about the question of ethnic cleansing, and this is something that has been going around the sort of news and various different international legal conversations, the whether or not this would constitute ethnic cleansing and what ethnic cleansing actually means as it relates to international law. And then we'll just finish by thinking about why it matters, because ultimately, I'm personally skeptical that the Trump-Gaza plan will actually be implemented. I know he's reiterated how serious he is about the plan, and I know quite worryingly in the last few days, Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, has supported this plan, which does, at least in my opinion, worry me a lot more than just Trump from the other side of the world mentioning it. But even if it doesn't happen, I want to explain why this is so important, why it matters that something like this is taking place. And we'll get to that towards the end of this podcast episode. But first, I just want to begin by thinking about the Gaza Plan. So, in terms of the context, we know that ever since October 2023, the State of Israel has been embroiled in a conflict with the armed group Hamas and Palestinian Jihad in the Gaza Strip. This has led to untold amounts of casualties and to an immense amount of suffering and destruction of the Gaza Strip. A lot of the destruction has led to the displacement of the civilian population in Gaza, and there have been widespread condemnations in relation to various different war crimes that have been documented in relation to this war, crimes against humanity, and there is even a case in the International Court of Justice concerning whether or not Israel has violated the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, a genocide case. So, ultimately, the beginning of the Trump administration saw quite a positive shift in this war because we saw a ceasefire be negotiated, and this ceasefire has more or less held since this has taken place. There's been potentially allegations of skirmishes and things taking place, but ultimately there has not been the full conduct of hostilities that there were before, and there has been the slow and gradual transferal of hostages in the first stage of the ceasefire negotiations. If you want me to go into more detail about the ceasefire negotiations and think about what they are and what the next steps are for the ceasefire, let me know in the comments and I might do an episode on that as well. But ultimately, this is all positive on this side, okay? Thinking about the ceasefire, thinking about drawing this conflict to an end, and thinking about a sort of post-conflict resolution and what might be done with the Gaza Strip now that it has been basically almost entirely destroyed. But then we get the Trump proposal, the Trump-Gaza plan. Last week, I believe, or the week before, President Trump proposed his plan for the Gaza Strip, and it ultimately involves, the sort of long and short of this plan is the involving of the transfer of the Palestinian population out of the Gaza Strip. That would mean the transfer of over 2 million people. The aim is for the United States to, quote, take over Gaza and, quote, clean out the whole thing. So the cleaning out proposal potentially refers to the reconstruction and rebuilding of Gaza. But the most important point of this plan is the fact that the Trump administration has proposed the moving wholesale of the Palestinian population out of the Gaza Strip by force if necessary. Quote from Donald Trump, "The US will take over the Gaza Strip and we will do a job with it too. We will be responsible for dismantling all the dangerous, unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site." Further quotes include, "This could be the Riviera of the Middle East." Now, the idea behind this plan is seemingly, as some commentators have mentioned, that Donald Trump is seeing the Gaza Strip and the plans for the Gaza Strip as something of a real estate deal. The idea that he's going to renovate and redevelop, and this is like a development project, which would be just absolutely outrageous, especially and most importantly, not the fact that the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip needs to happen, and the United States should probably commit quite a substantial amount of aid in being able to contribute to the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. But the fact that this plan involves the moving, or often forcibly if necessary, of the entire population out of the Gaza Strip. Not moving temporarily while they reconstruct, but moving permanently into other countries who obviously have rejected this plan. So ultimately, it should be no surprise to anybody that this is something that is obviously a violation of international law. Now, I will cite all of the different elements or some of the different elements that clearly make this point known that this is a definite violation of the UN Charter and the violation of international law. But just generally speaking, the sort of long and short of this section should be that forcibly transferring a population out of a geographical area is against international law, is a violation of international law. You can't just force a whole population of people away and move out a particular area. Now, there are various different areas of international law that cite very clearly that this is a violation, and I don't really need to go into why this is a violation of international law, but I will regardless. Ultimately, if we just look at the Rome Statute, you can see that in Article 6 of the Rome Statute, which concerns the genocide crime, that Article 6E of the Rome Statute tells us that it constitutes genocide to forcibly transfer children of one group to another group. Now, I have seen some international commentators, international legal scholars, including this part of the Rome Statute, or that part of the Genocide Convention, Article 2E of the Genocide Convention, as part of this plan. I'm going to get to that in a minute, because I don't know if that's necessarily the case. It isn't still, nevertheless, terrible, but I don't think this would necessarily constitute genocide, and I'll explain why in a second. But more easily, you can just say that this absolutely violates international law as a crime against humanity. Article 7 of the Rome Statute says, quote, "For the purposes of this statute, a crime against humanity means any of the following acts committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack." And Article 7(1)(d) of the Rome Statute lists, quote, "deportation or forcible transfer of population" as part of this crime against humanity. That is an act that would be done if we were to apply this standard to the Gaza plan that Trump proposed. That would be done as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population. So it would automatically be a crime against humanity. Now, the deportation or transfer of the population is defined further in Article 7(2)(d) of the Rome Statute as, quote, "Deportation or forcible transfer of population means forced displacement of the persons concerned by expulsion or other coercive acts from the area in which they are lawfully present without grounds permitted under international law." There are no reasonable grounds permitted under international law in this case that would define the ability for the Trump administration, for the US state, or for the Israeli state to perform this action. If we were to concern this as part of an ongoing armed conflict, and given the fact that the Palestinian people would definitely resist this plan, this attempt, you could even include the fact that this would constitute a war crime as well. So Article 8 of the Rome Statute concerns, Article 8 2b VIII concerns, quote, the transfer directly or indirectly by the occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the territory occupied, or the deportation or transfer or all or parts of the population of the occupied territory within or outside this territory. Now, the question of whether or not the Gaza Strip constitutes an occupied territory is one of a little bit of a controversial question, at least prior to October the 7th. Prior to October the 7th, the question of whether or not the Gaza Strip was occupied was a little bit controversial, and even the International Court of Justice, in their advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising out of the occupation of Palestinian territory case that took place last year, or at least was decided last year, sort of danced around the edges of Gaza occupation. Since October the 7th, and since the IDF have been present in the Gaza Strip for almost an entirety of a year, this, of course, is not a question anymore. It would be an occupying power. So to move any Israeli civilians and to settle any Israeli civilians in the Gaza Strip would be a war crime. And to deport or transfer any of the population outside of this occupied territory would also be a war crime. Now, the reason why, by the way, the question of occupation of the Gaza Strip is complicated prior to October the 7th is because you sort of have a very, very fixed and quite rigid definition of occupation as cited in international humanitarian law. And one of the things that is a requirement for something to be occupied, a territory to be occupied, is either that there are boots on the ground or there is the capability of deploying boots on the ground in a reasonable at a reasonable pace, in a reasonable way. Now, the reason why that wasn't the case prior to October the 7th is because, firstly, there was not Israeli IDF soldiers on the ground in Gaza, and the capability of deploying soldiers on the ground in Gaza was, of course, very, very difficult because it took a couple of months at least at least after October the 7th for this to take place. But it's not a very satisfactory answer, that question, the answer to that question, because ultimately, while it might not necessarily have fit the specific definition of occupation as defined by international humanitarian law, it's nevertheless included aspects of occupation and aspects of clearly a duty on the part of the Israeli state to maintain and look after the population of the Gaza Strip, because they had imposed a blockade, they had imposed control of all air, sea and land borders with the Gaza Strip. So the International Court of Justice came up with this idea of there being certain residual obligations on the part of the Israeli state when, as they have left the Gaza Strip, as they demobilized and left the Gaza Strip in 2005, 2006, they still had residual control over parts of the Gaza Strip, over their electricity, over their water supply, over their borders. And so because they still had residual control, they still had residual obligations over those particular kinds of things. So it was a sort of grey area of occupation, which doesn't neatly fit into the category of occupation within IHL. But that whole conversation is irrelevant because since October the 7th, the IDF have been on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Now, I told you I want to go back to the genocide question. Now, the question of whether or not the conduct of the Israeli state since October the 7th represents genocide is one that I'm not going to get into here. I wanted to touch on the question of this specific plan of the Trump administration to clear out the Gaza Strip, to remove everybody out of the Gaza Strip as constituting genocide. Now, ultimately, I would argue that this would not constitute genocide. Now, by doing so, I am not arguing that it would be any less bad because it's not genocide. I don't see genocide, personally, as any worse than any of the other international crimes. Genocide, in my opinion, is as bad as a crime against humanity and a war crime, okay? They're just different types of crime. They require different kinds of acts to be committed. Crimes against humanity are far more expansive in terms of the kinds of acts that are captured by that particular offence, and the standard to show that is a lot lower. It requires a sense of scale. It requires that it is committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. Genocide is very different. Genocide is very specific, and genocide requires a very specific, highly specialised intent. This is why genocide is so difficult to prove in international law, and why personally I don't find genocide as a concept to have much utility in international law. And I'm sure I'll talk about that more and more in the future as we go on. But ultimately, the international legal scholars who have come out and included Article 6E or Article 2E of the Genocide Convention or the Rome Statute, respectively, the sort of forcible transferring of children from one group to another group as part of this plan, I think that's misguided. Because firstly, the idea here is not necessarily the act itself, but something is genocide on the basis of its intent. So fundamentally, the act of transferring a population from one group to another group, or specifically transferring children from one group to another group, would have to be done with the specific intent. The dolus specialis for genocide is, of course, the intent to destroy in whole or in part the protected group in question, whether that be a racial, ethnical, religious, minority group, any of these kinds of groups. So the standard by which that is met in international law, at least at the moment, at least in the jurisprudence as it stands right now, is something known as the only reasonable inference standard. Essentially, in looking at an action, in looking at an act that would fall under the Genocide Convention, in looking at an act that would be one of the 5 acts committed, so killing members of a group, transferring children of members of a group, imposing conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the group, preventing births within the group, etc., 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 you have to think, essentially, what is the reason, what is the rationale, what is the motivation for committing this act? And if it is the case that the only reasonable inference that can be drawn from those set of facts is an intent to destroy in whole or in part, then it would constitute a genocidal act. If there are any other inferences that are also reasonable, that could be reasonably able to explain why certain acts have been committed, then it therefore fails to meet the genocide standard. And ultimately, if we think about this particular question, firstly, I don't think would necessarily constitute the actus reus of genocide in this case, because you're not just forcibly transferring children of one group to another group, you're just transferring the whole group from one location to a different location. The idea of the forcible transfer of children concerns the assimilation of children into a different culture and as a result, the eradication of that particular group's culture. So an example that could be utilized theoretically is the transfer of Ukrainian children into the Russian Federation and the Russification of Ukrainian children. But the transferring of an entire population from one geographical territory to a different geographical territory is a little bit different. So first, I wouldn't say that it meets the act of genocide as cited in the convention. I also don't think it meets the mens rea of genocide, because I think the only reasonable inference of genocidal intent is not present, because ultimately Trump's plan here is already cited. He already cites his plan. It's a crazy plan, but it's the plan of, quote, turning the Gaza Strip into the Riviera of the Middle East. This includes a complete and utter lack of concern for the Palestinian people, absolutely, but it does not necessarily include a distinct intent to destroy in whole or in part the entirety of the Palestinian population. I don't think Trump personally gives any care to the Palestinian population. He's looking at this, as some commentators have mentioned, as a real estater, a realtor, a real estate agent, somebody who wants to do a development on this part of the Gaza Strip. But nevertheless, it's a crime against humanity. It's a war crime. It's a violation of international law, and it's absolutely abhorrent in any meaningful way. And the question that I want to ask now is whether or not this would constitute ethnic cleansing. Now, the whole of the international community and a lot of people in news and in media and all these different places have referred to this plan as ethnic cleansing. Now, the term ethnic cleansing is one that was mainly popularized. It gained popularity with reference to the Yugoslav wars and the former Yugoslavia and the events that took place in and around there. And ultimately, it is not a concept that is specifically defined as a crime in international law. So just like international criminal law has genocide, it has crimes against humanity, it has war crimes, it has the crime of aggression, it doesn't have the crime of ethnic cleansing. So it is not something that is a specifically defined crime in international law, but we can find the idea of ethnic cleansing all over the place within international criminal law. It just isn't specifically defined as that. So the UN Commission of Experts report to the Security Council in 1993 on the Yugoslav wars defines ethnic cleansing as, quote, rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove persons of a given group from the area. Now, fundamentally, we can find ideas and definitions of ethnic cleansing when we think about the crime against humanity statute, part of the Rome Statute on crimes against humanity, the deportation or forcible transfer of a population, the forced displacement of persons concerned by expulsion or other coercive acts from the area in which they are lawfully present without grounds permitted under international law. So while ethnic cleansing isn't its own specific crime in international law, it is definitely the idea of ethnic cleansing, the transfer of a population of a particular ethnic group out of a geographical territory. That idea is captured by multiple different crimes in international law. It is captured by war crimes. It is captured by crimes against humanity. Which is why we probably don't need a specific crime for ethnic cleansing, because we can just reference the crimes against humanity provision within the Rome Statute. Or hopefully in the future we'll be able to reference the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, which I would like to see become ratified and enter into force in the future. But ultimately, what this plan involves is, as defined by the UN Commission's report from 1993, or any colloquial definition of ethnic cleansing, it is ostensibly ethnic cleansing. It is ostensibly part of a process of rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove persons of a given group from the area, to remove persons of a given group, to remove Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip. This would be ethnic cleansing, absolutely. If you are uncomfortable with the phrase ethnic cleansing and you're going to start to sort of lawyer your way out of that question by saying that ethnic cleansing isn't actually a crime in international law, then fine. It is a crime against humanity. It is a crime against humanity as cited by the Rome Statute, by Article 7 of the Rome Statute, Article 7, 1d of the Rome Statute. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter whether or not you call it ethnic cleansing or not. I would call it ethnic cleansing. I would call it a crime against humanity. I would call it a war crime. And fundamentally, I would call it completely disastrous and unlawful and shows a complete disregard for international law. And it's one of the reasons why I've started this podcast, because at a time in which we can see the global hegemonic power essentially showing a complete disregard for international legal rules, this is a very important thing that we need to uphold. It all forms part of a larger worry that I have and that many other international lawyers have about the complete disregard for the international community, for international legal order. This includes, but is not limited to, the Trump administration's global shutdown of US aid assistance, the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords, the withdrawal from the World Health Organization, the withdrawal for support of UNRWA, and placing sanctions on persons working for the International Criminal Court. All of these things are absolutely outrageous. All of these things are terrible. And so while I'm ultimately skeptical about whether or not this plan will actually be implemented, I've obviously very hopeful about the fact that all of the countries within the neighbouring states of Israel, so Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, etc., have all completely rejected this plan. that helped me believe that this is a plan that will not be implemented, because ultimately, if people attempt to force Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, there's not really anywhere for them to go, and it will cause a humanitarian crisis and an international crisis that I hope the soft power of the international community would be able to prevent from happening. And while I'm also happy to have seen that the United States is not committed to putting troops on the ground to implement this plan, at least not right now, I am also worried about the fact that very recently, in the last few days, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has offered his support for this plan. This is not a good thing, and it's really something that needs to be condemned by anybody and everybody who has any kind of voice and any kind of authority on the subject of international law, or law at all, generally speaking. Now, even if this plan doesn't happen, and I'm skeptical that it would happen, okay, and I want to remain skeptical that it's going to happen, and if you think that that's delusional, just let me be delusional in my delusions that this is a plan that will not happen. But ultimately, the fact that such a plan has been proposed by the President of the United States, so clearly in disregard for the rules of international law, is a bad enough erosion on the system that it is worth talking about in and of itself. It shouldn't matter if you have people who try to downplay this proposal as, oh, well, it's not going to happen, or if you're skeptical about it not happening, so don't worry about it. The fact that this is proposed is bad enough. The fact that it could happen is a whole different story, is a whole different horrendous tragedy that we'd have to deal with if we ever got to that bridge. But regardless of whether or not it will happen, the fact that it was even proposed by a President of the United States, by the head of state of the world's largest hegemonic power, is really, really important, and is really, really detrimental, and is something that we should all be talking about. Now, there have been various instances in the past where we have seen the United States eroding trust in international law and institutions. I'm not going to say that the United States has been a perfect arbiter of the international legal community prior to the Trump administration, and it is only the Trump administration that is eroding this particular, these institutions. Obviously, that's not true. From Vietnam to Iraq, we can see that clearly the United States picks and chooses which parts of international law it wants to follow and tries to legal its way out of any obligations it might have in relation to international legal obligations. And if it really wants to do something, like invade Iraq, it will do it. It might try and do so using the language of international law, so the language of self-defense in the UN Charter, for example, with reference to WMDs, but regardless of whether or not those facts actually have any merit, is an irrelevant consideration for the United States, because they'll just do whatever they want. So that is bad enough as it is, and we shouldn't just talk about the Trump administration as being the first administration to disregard the rules of international law. A broader, more important conversation needs to be had about the rules-based system of international law that we have seen the United States consistently and constantly and consistently disregard over decades. Okay, but while there has been this erosion of trust in international law on the part of the United States, there are also instances where the United States has in fact been a force for good in the world order. The United States has historically played a very key role in the creation and the development of human rights, the Universal Declaration, for example, the UN Charter, the Twin Covenants, and even, you'd be surprised, the Rome Statute. The United States was very much involved in the development of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. It just, when it got to the point at which they should have signed on to and joined the International Criminal Court, they decided not to, which is unfortunate. They've played a very key role in the post-World War II justice system, the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials. They facilitated the Good Friday Agreement in the United Kingdom. They've been protecting human rights, or attempting to protect human rights and the sovereign integrity of their allies in places like Bosnia and Ukraine. And so ultimately, there is a lot of history that the United States has had with international law that is undoubtedly good. There's a lot that's undoubtedly bad, and I'm going to spend plenty of time on this podcast talking about all the bad that the United States has done with regard to international law. But as a number of authors at Just Security put it, quote, the Trump administration betrays that history, the history of the United States in upholding human rights, and those values in ways that promote the interests of authoritarians and demagogues worldwide, and will strip Americans and others of fundamental human rights. Ultimately, then, while the Biden administration doesn't have the perfect track record on international law and geopolitics, nor did the previous Trump administration, nor does the Obama administration, nor did the Bush administration, obviously, but the Trump administration this time around feels very, very different. Not only does it feel like an erosion of international rules, but a complete ignorance and disregard for international rules as well. Now, some of you might argue and disagree with me and say, well, the Biden administration are just as bad, or other administrations are just as bad. I would disagree, and I would probably have to spend some time putting forth an argument for why this is considerably worse than the previous administrations, but I do so with the very key context that by saying that this is worse than the Biden administration, I'm not in any way saying that the Biden administration has been amazing on international law or good on international law. It could just be less bad than the Trump administration. So that's what this podcast is going to be about. This podcast is going to be about talking about developments in international law, specifically trying to think about how we protect international law, international legal institutions, the world order that we have, and to improve it and to make it better, and to try and help in developing international law in that kind of way. And so the result of that is we're going to be talking quite a lot about the Trump administration, and we're going to be talking quite a lot about how the Trump administration fundamentally undermines global politics, fundamentally undermines international legal system. And if the Trump administration improves, I doubt it, but if the Trump administration improves or we get a different administration in the future, then maybe this podcast will turn to be more positive and start looking at some of the more positive aspects that might take place in the future. But ultimately, that's what this podcast is going to be about, covering international law, talking about the sort of cutting edge issues in international law, thinking about international law and geopolitics, and thinking about how there are various different actors around the world, dictators, demagogues, and fascists, let's just say that are trying to undermine the international legal order. I want to finish by just focusing very quickly on the cowardice of other international lawyers. Now, I got off Twitter or X not that long ago, but before I did, I was definitely somebody who saw and was very much present in looking at the various different arguments between international lawyers on various different issues, specifically and almost exclusively surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You have a whole host of international legal scholars who approach this Israeli-Palestinian conflict from a very pro-Palestinian side, and you have a whole host of scholars that approach this topic from a very pro-Israeli side. And I personally disagreed in various different ways with both sides at different stages, depending on the conversation that we were talking about. If we were talking about the genocide case, then there's reasons why I disagreed with the pro-Palestinian side. If we talked about war crimes, for example, there was reasons why I disagreed with the pro-Israeli side. But one of the things that I found very, very important and I found very, very insightful was the fact that every single international lawyer was very, very willing to disagree with the other side of the debate at various different stages throughout. So the pro-Israeli lawyers, or the lawyers that were more charitable towards the actions and policies of the Israeli state, were very quick to consistently call out and to challenge the perspectives of the pro-Palestinian side. And so when we got to this plan, the Trump-Gaza plan, and I saw quite a lot of silence on the part of the pro-Israeli side, I found this to be something of a cowardly move. Fundamentally, if you have a voice as an international lawyer who is more qualified than me in lots of ways, and most of them are more qualified than me, and you have a platform to spread your voice, and you have used your voice to challenge what you would see as pro-Palestinian narrative, or in some cases the pro-Hamas narrative, or whatever, then you should have had a duty as well to have used your voice to call out this clear violation of human rights, and this clearly violating this policy that clearly violates international law. You should have had a duty to do that. And so there can be disagreements about the conduct of hostilities in the Gaza war, whether or not it constitutes a genocide, the appropriate endgame for solving this crisis, whether or not a one-state solution is preferable or a two-state solution, what should happen to the right of return of refugees. All these things you can have disagreements about, and you can have good faith disagreements about. But this proposal here is unequivocally unlawful, and any international legal scholar or international relations scholar who has spent the past year supporting Israeli policies or challenging this pro-Palestinian narrative should have called this out. And if you hadn't done that, there's a few of you that I have in mind who didn't do that, who have been very, very silent on this Gaza plan while very, very vocal on everything else, then this is cowardice. You're a coward. This is something that you should have had the foresight and the courage to be able to call out in being consistent in your beliefs. I might get into that in more detail in future episodes. I might talk about that more, but fundamentally that's sort of where I begin and end thinking about other international lawyers who are remarkably silent on this question of whether or not this is a good idea or the lawfulness of this plan. You should have called it out. There are some who did. There are some who are generally pro-Israeli scholarship, or at least very charitable towards the Israeli narrative, who did call this out as the outrage that it was. And so those people are not cowards, but some people who didn't definitely are. And I'm just going to finish by thinking about an article that was written in Egil a few days ago called "Speaking Truth to Trump on the International Rule of Law." The final quote on this particular piece is that, quote, "International lawyers are needed to expand the category by promoting authentic international law. We can speak truth and redefine power." And I think this is going to be an important thing to remember, that we've got 4 more years of this nonsense. And so it's important that we uphold and protect the international legal institutions that are under attack, that are not just under attack by the Trump administration, but are under attack from a variety of other administrations, from a variety of other states, and even are under attack from within, with people who have very wacky and wild interpretations of international law that undermine and erode that institution and erode it as an idea. So that's fundamentally it. If you've enjoyed this, let me know in the comments down below. If you have any comments and questions, let me know in the comments down below. If you've got any suggestions about what we talk about next, I'm going to spend quite a lot of time researching and thinking about the recent proposals for Ukraine and the developments that have been going on there. So I'll be trying to do this on a regular basis. This will be running alongside, by the way, the Jurisprudence podcast. Me and Charlotte are still doing that. It's taken a break for a while, as well as obviously running alongside all of the ordinary scheduled lessons that we have coming out on the Law Academy. So I hope you follow along with this. And if you're somebody who is not that interested in international law or geopolitics, I understand. You might be more of a commercial lawyer or a domestic lawyer or whatever. Still, nevertheless, I think it's important to keep an eye on this stuff and to think about this in more detail. So I hope you follow along with these episodes. And like I said, if you've got any suggestions for future episodes, let me know, and I'll see everybody in the future in other episodes.